So moving on to segment 3.
Rapidly moving on.
Rapidly moving on. And actually segment 3 I think should be fairly short, so we might be able to make up some time here. In so much as
Are you suggesting people might be bored watching it?
No. I have to edit this. So in the case of segment 3, we are moving on to the news that that so-called Nighthawkers, or as you would strongly have them called, thieves, are having a detrimental effect on the landscape of Hadrian's Wall. This actually was a headline from the BBC. It was in other news outlets as well, but they all use basically the term Nighthawkers, and they're targeting sites such as Corbridge and mile castles on the Wall, places that even archaeologists aren't actually allowed to excavate. In previous watching briefs, we've mentioned how one of the wonderful byproducts of, for example, moles digging holes near the wall is that we get access to bits of pottery that they've just sort of shoved out of the way up above ground, because we're not allowed to dig there because it is a scheduled ancient monument, it's an internationally significant monument, so on and so forth. Mark Harrison says here, head of the Heritage, Crime and Policing Advice for Historic England, said that we may never see or fully understand objects taken or damaged because they have been removed from their original sites with no care or record as to their history or context. And a lot of this material basically ends up for sale. For example, there's a couple of very key large shops in York which will buy this material, more or less no questions asked, then sell it on to international tourists. And that
Allegedly.
Allegedly, yes, allegedly, but it's on the shelves. You can see this stuff, and I am making the very strong assertion that is quite possibly the case. Yes, as you say, allegedly, it is a problem, and the reason why we're highlighting this, I think, is also because this month there've been a couple of interesting related issues as well, including wreck divers, but also, before we move on to the wreck divers, for example, a Roman skull which was stolen from a dig in North Yorkshire. Thieves entered the dig at Old Malton Gate and removed a skull from the site which had been partially covered. The theft happened overnight on Wednesday, the 9th of May, but police only released details on June the 18th. Officers are appealing for information about the theft. Now, when I shared, for example, the Roman skull story on the RKC Facebook page, someone commented saying, this is why I sometimes find myself sleeping overnight on archaeological sites. Archaeologists will be that concerned about this stuff. In the case of, for example, Binchester Roman Fort in County Durham, I know that when they found materials such as, for example, there was a very nice shrine pillar, dedication pillar. They couldn't excavate it properly because they found it towards the end of the day, and they could not risk leaving it in the ground half exposed. They had to just pull it out of the ground like a potato, because people do come in overnight on those digs and see what they can take home. In the context of what we've been talking about as far as the monetary challenges, especially facing archaeology and archivists and this kind of thing, what is the solution to this problem? Because I'm going to let you outline the wreck divers, but what are all of these different things related? Hadrian's Wall, Roman skull in Yorkshire, and wreck diving. And if that is the case, how can we tackle this stuff? Is this something that needs a different approach?
Okay, and I need to declare an interest here because I've worked with Mark Harrison at Historic England on heritage crime investigations, and I've been involved with the initiatives that Historic England have been putting forward about combating heritage crimes really since they began talking about them 5-6 years ago now, at least. When Mark first joined Historic England on secondment from Kent Police, as then was, he was a chief inspector with Kent Police before he went to Historic England. I think what we're dealing with here, and this particular Hadrian's Wall story was very deliberately put out there by Historic England to highlight the issue and to get people, to make people aware of it, and hopefully to generate calls to police, information lines, Crime Stoppers, etc. Because what we're dealing with, and it is, you mentioned that I prefer, I don't like the term Nighthawk. I never use the term Nighthawk. No. If I do, I always put it in quotes and then say, or as we should say, thieves, because what these are.
Well, it makes them sound like 1930s sort of comic book heroes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know, the Nighthawk strikes again.
No,
you know,
they're thieves who happen to use metal detectors to find metal objects that they can then almost certainly sell. Yeah. And in fact, you talked about shops. I mean, there is a you go to France and Belgium, and there are shops that sell material from the Western Front, which is now illegal to dig up. I wouldn't like to guess where they source their stuff from. No. eBay is the big one. eBay is full of artifacts. Some of them are openly declared as metal detecting finds. Say that they're found legally. Some even say they've been declared to PAS, Automatic Antiquities Scheme. But others are unprovenanced, or you find material that's said from that was found in the collection of an elderly neighbour after they died, or something like that. These fudge provenances. The classic one for military aircraft, bits of military aircraft, is a piece of ex-Spitfire found before the Protection of Military Remains Act. They're getting their retaliation in first, and unless you can actually prove that that particular aeroplane came down, that particular material was excavated after the Protection of Military Remains Act, you've got no way of controlling it. I think, and just to complete the picture, if you like, and again, it's another Historic England story. Historic England working this time with Kent Police, the Maritime Coast Guard Agency, colleagues across the Channel in France, as well. This was an international investigation. But 2 weeks ago, 2 wreck divers were tried at Canterbury Crown Court and were actually jailed for the theft of artefacts from the wreck of HMS Hermes, which was a seaplane aircraft transport that was torpedoed in the English Channel in 1914, with the loss of 44 of her crew. So she's actually a maritime military grave as well. But these 2 guys, Nigel Ingram of Tenham and John Blight of Winchelsea, they were jailed for 4 years and for 3.5 years for theft from this heritage site. It's protected wreck. Well, what I was going to say, which is the final point before we continue the discussion, is what these things have in common is they are about the financial commodification of the past, whether it's a copper engine room condenser from a World War I warship wreck that's worth 5, 10, 60,000 pounds or more for one of the big ones, or whether it's a Roman brooch that you can flog for 50 quid on eBay.
And so is that
it's about turning the past into money. Is
that copper condenser, does its value come from its metal, or is it actually as an artifact?
It's the value of scrap metal.
Right. Okay.
Other bits of that shit on the collector's market would have a value because they're from that ship. Things like portholes and things like that, you would melt down. You'd sell them. You'd sell it at a car boot or on eBay again or whatever. Probably having cleaned up. The classic case was I think it was a propeller from a World War I submarine, a U-boat, that ended up as somebody's coffee table until it was seized by the police when they were arrested for a different set of offences, different diver.
Wow. And it's interesting about, for example, in this case, they are deploying similarly weak assertions about how they got hold of the material. For example, Mr. Ingram says here, told the police he had taken a condenser unit from the vicinity of the HMS Hermes, but did not think that it had come from the wreck itself.
Yeah.
Because the Hermes was just going over the top of where there was a condenser, got torpedoed.
And to give you an idea of what they were dealing with, this is just a small part of the and again, it's interesting that the Crown Prosecution Service, working with the police and Historic England and Maritime and Coast Guard Agency on all these cases, where they can, they're applying charges like theft because they tend to carry higher penalties than specifically heritage crimes.
Bringing us back to, bearing in mind this idea of heritage crimes, bringing us back to this initial question then of what can and should be done. Obviously, you've mentioned the fact that for example, Historic England has former police working for them in this context. I'm minded to mention the fact that I am aware of the irony here that we've just been mentioning in the previous segment, the fact that there's not enough space in archives for material. Some people would argue that material should be essentially profligated, should just be given to the people, and the people somehow curate it and pass it amongst themselves, passing on stories, which in some ways is a very pleasing sort of soft history folk thing going on there, but in other ways it's very unaccountable. Material can get damaged, it can go missing, all this sort of stuff. What is the balance? I mean, you mentioned there's an increasing move towards trying to actually assert theft charges and actually make it clear that you can't do that, you shouldn't do that. But I mean, is this more of a cultural thing? In so much as, even in, for example, so again, I'm quoting the BBC article here, they talk about how, where is it? We know that Mike Collins, the Historic England's Inspector of Ancient Monuments, said, "We know that the majority of the metal detecting community complies with the laws and regulations regarding discovery and recovery of objects from the land." I think that's an assertion that you can't prove. But anyway, you can't prove the majority does that because it's not like there's a census. But, he goes on to say, the small number of people who steal artefacts and damage ancient sites are breaking the law and robbing us all of the knowledge and understanding that objects from the past can give us. Is this a cultural thing? Is this an element of actively, and I'm going to use the phrase, going after the culture of the metal detectorist? I mean, it's one of those things where, as a sort of left-leaning individual, somehow I feel as though, oh no, I'm squashing someone's rights to do something. But actually, no. In this context, these are often, you'll have gatherings, you'll have definitely online forums. There are people who swap tips on how to report their material in such a way that they get maximum profit, or indeed how to obfuscate the origin of their material. Should there be a more active, whether it's a task force on a government level or police or just the archaeological community itself, going and really highlighting that this is actively breaking the law? This isn't cheeky chaps. This isn't, having a chance on a farmer's land and give him a tenner and take away a big chunk of gold. This is illegal activity.
Yeah. Okay, a couple of things on this. One of the things that Historic England have had to do in this whole heritage crime initiative, as it began life as, there's a thing called ARCH, which is a loose organisation organised by Historic England of the Alliance to Reduce Crimes Against Heritage, which organisations and bodies can sign up to. But one of the things that Historic England have had to do is to go to all of our police forces, and don't forget, in this country we have we don't have a national police force with one single code of practice and methodology and sets of priorities. We have regional police forces which have their own sets of priorities and so on. One of the things Historic England have had to do is go to each of those forces and say, okay, when your operators take a 999 call or take a 911 call or receive information across the desk at a police station where one's still open about a crime that's taking place, that there is the category in their reporting system for a heritage crime, because that wasn't the case. One of the other things that they've been successful in doing is getting the prosecution guidelines changed by the Crown Prosecution Service, so that a judge, and as will have happened in this case of the two divers, can see the heritage aspects of a crime as an aggravating circumstances, therefore warranting a larger penalty, a stiffer penalty.
Yeah.
So
because in that sense it requires specific knowledge of the value of this material to target it and then sell it on. Yeah. It's not. This isn't just someone finding. Well, I suppose you could argue in the case of someone who's just gathering copper, but again, you've got to be looking for the wreck, to do that.
That's the point, and underlying this is the value, is the idea that heritage has a universal value and an ownership on behalf of all of us, and that's not just us who happen to be living in Britain and are UK passport holders, but somebody visiting this country has every right to see a Roman brooch from Hadrian's wall, and if that's in somebody's in a box underneath somebody's bed, or has been flogged off to somebody in the States through eBay, then that is actually something that's been lost to. We talked about archives just now. It's very interesting. One of the most interesting papers about this idea of spreading the curation of artifacts through individuals. There's a very interesting paper on this, been published as a model for curating artifacts from particular archaeological sites. It happens to be a maritime archaeological site. If I told you that the paper that promotes this as an idea is authored by Gregory P. Stem, who was the Chief Executive Officer of Odyssey Marine Exploration, that might suggest that maybe there's a slightly self-serving element in that. Basically, it's saying, and you see it with the various coin collecting bodies. The American Numismatic Federation, I think they're called in particular, association, are very strong on saying, we are legitimate collectors. We have a right to collect this material. It's a human right to collect this material, because if it's not been acquired illegally. And don't attack us for it. Private collection is a good thing. And we are saving this material. The worst cases you see are and again we saw it around Sakemka. One of the arguments, and I actually had a conversation outside Christie's when Sakemka was sold with somebody who said, of course, it's perfectly right that it's sold to a private collector because they, meaning the Egyptians, who happened to be undergoing some certain political upheavals at the time, they can't guarantee to keep it safe. What do you do? So there's a lot of issues around this. Metal detecting in particular, and again, I'm sure you've heard, as I have, members of the National Council for Metal Detecting and other metal detecting advocates who are very against any further restrictions on their hobby, which they see as the people's hobby. They see themselves in many cases as people's historians now, and many of them do have a great deal of knowledge about what they collect. Some of them, unfortunately, about how much it's all worth and where they can flog it.
And often that's the first thing that comes up is, oh, that's worth. And it's from the 2nd century AD, and
exactly. Oh, yeah, a coin of Gallienus from the mint at so and so in that condition,
Which is actually, though, oddly in its own right, remarkable knowledge. I know Roman coin experts who won't know exactly where all the coins have been made. It's just knowledge that's being used in
and I think we have to say that the PAS in some respects has done some very good things, but I think, again, talking to colleagues recently, and in fact I was talking to some colleagues at the weekend about this, and I think there's a sense that the PAS and its raison d'etre and its resourcing and its philosophy perhaps needs to be revisited. And certainly I know that, for example, the idea of that there's a lot of opposition now in the archaeological sector to the large-scale archaeological metal detecting rallies which can, even when the PAS is able to service the material, it can swamp the local fines liaison officers with material, even when it's declared. There's no. This is where you can get dozens of people literally, surface stripping an area of artifacts over the course of the weekend, often paying 20, 30 quid a pop for a day's detecting, and the economics of that and certainly the ethics of that are coming under increasing question. And I think we need to be, we're aware of that. So, the issues around metal detecting aren't just about a small minority of thieves who the media insists on still calling Nighthawks.
Yeah.
They're much wider things. I think now metal detecting on the large scale has been going for about 40 years now, and it's becoming increasingly popular. There's even hints now that some of the some areas are almost being worked out, and people are looking for different things to detect, or different or new areas.
And that's exactly, I think, what I mean when I talk about culture. As in, this is almost from an anthropological perspective, talking about this group of people as a culture. As a way of thinking about and looking at the world. That culture needs to be understood and addressed.
Yes.
And because the thing is as well, I mean, you talk about how people can pay 20, 30, 40 quid a pop to have a day of going around someone's field. There'll also be gatherings that involve a burger van turning up, maybe some folk music. They turn it into an event.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And in that sense, it has all the trappings of a transient community actually moving around. So okay. And so really the purpose of this little segment, I think I wanted to just highlight obviously that this stuff is going on, how it's being reported in terms of nighthawking, but also this is a question that I don't think we can answer immediately in terms of how we.
What I would say is that if anybody watching this is aware of a heritage crime, or what they believe could be a heritage crime being committed, contact your local police. If you're in the UK, call Crime Stoppers, and we'll put the numbers up again below this segment.
But also, do you recall last month we were sharing the Heritage Watch app?
Yes, indeed. That's part of the
link
initiative.
below.
Yeah.
I think was that linked with Kent Police? I seem to recall. Or there's certainly been there've been consultations with
it's meant to be a national initiative. But the thing is, a lot of policing these days is what's called intelligence led. And if intelligence is coming in about crimes that can be solved, police officers like that because it makes them look good. If police officers solve crimes and get convictions, that makes it look good. Another reason, a chief constable who might not prioritise, heritage crime otherwise, if he can prosecute a metal detectorist or anybody else for that matter for theft, that's a crime of theft that's been solved.
Okay, well, we have another segment that went longer than I thought it might. but we're passionate about this stuff, and I think again it's important to cover all these topics properly, and this is undoubtedly something that we'll return to. For my part, I'm going to continue to look for and look into and talk about with people solutions to this cultural issue. Not least because, and I'll just end on something that I saw a couple of days ago in a local cash converters. The fact that I mean these aren't particularly sensitive machines, but basically consumer grade, almost toy level metal detectors are often sold as treasure finders.
Oh yes.
It's in that sense again it's a cultural phenomenon. The language of it is there as well. But let's move on.